Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English. We are now in your hymnals on page 538, 539 and following, where we are about now to address one of the most famous speeches in American political thought, political history, and I would argue literary history as well. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We'll also be looking at FDR's first inaugural address, and if you'll notice on page 538, 539, they have paired these two famous speeches together, or a speech and an address. Now the focus, and we want to put this at 2B right away, the focus of this address, of this study, both for the speech as well as the address, will be persuasive speech. Now in your high school career, you will have to give a persuasive speech. So we want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. We want to study a couple of examples of how well it can be done, so that when it's time for you at some point in your high school career to give a persuasive speech, you'll kind of have a sense of how you put that thing together. Notice right away, a persuasive speech, your textbook will tell you on 539. A speaker tries to convince listeners to think or act in a certain way. Good persuasive speeches present information and supporting evidence clearly, concisely, logically, so listeners can follow the reasoning. Persuasive speakers often use rhetorical devices. You want that term in your 2B annotations. Of course, we know this term rhetoric or rhetorical by virtue of 2B already. That's what we call our study at level 2B anyway. What does the text mean specifically? Not what the writer says, but how the writer says it. Rhetorical devices, patterns of words, ideas that create emphasis, stir emotion. We're going to see this in both these speeches, stirring of emotion. Common rhetorical devices include some of the following. We want to write these down, and we're going to be looking for these in our study. Parallelism. Write it down. Parallelism. Repeating a grammatical structure or an argument of words to create rhythm and momentum. Restatement. Expressing the same idea in different words to clarify, stress key points. Repetition, the using of the same words frequently to reinforce concepts and unify the speech. And then finally, analogy, drawing a comparison that shows a similarity between two unlike things, powerful word pictures. Now under reading skill, we're going to evaluate persuasion by looking at these persuasive techniques, right, and the emotionally charged language. Now all of that is what your textbook says. I want to give you a couple of ideas to write down as well right now, because when we're writing persuasive writing, and we'll be doing that as well, there are two things that we always are considering as we write. Let's write these down. One, anytime we're writing persuasively, again, just to remind, we are writing not to change someone's mind, but rather to challenge someone's opinion. That's the best we can hope for, yes? Okay? And to do that, we do two things. One, write these down. What we call consideration of the historical precedent. Now, I know this is review, but we'll say it nonetheless, and then you're going to hear it throughout your high school career. When you're writing to persuade, there's two things you must consider. One, consideration of the historical precedent. In other words, what has come before. Before, in other words, someone else thought the very ideas that you thought. By the way, we're not saying that you're not original. We're just simply saying you are original to you. Because the ideas that you come up with, that you're so certain no one else in the history of the world has ever thought about, chances are somebody has thought about them. By the way, that's why we have things like a literature class, so that you can kind of be reminded, oh, I'm not the first one to ask a question like this. Sometimes the question that you've asked is going to be framed or phrased in different language, but once you understand the language, you're going to say, oh yeah, I guess I've thought about that as well. In other words, write it in your notes, consideration of the historical precedent is what we call research. Before you start any kind of speech or writing that is controversial, persuasive, you always ask, what have other people had to say about this topic? That's called research, right? I used to say that years ago when I was lecturing university classes, that I could always tell in a political science class or whatever, I could always tell who my seniors in college were versus my freshmen in college by asking the simple question, what's the best form of government? My freshmen would immediately step into it. The best form of government is a democracy because blah, blah, blah. My seniors, who had of course been educated and understood the power of the historical precedent, would often respond by, it's a very interesting question. Where would you like to begin? Let's begin by defining our terms. What do you mean by best? What do you mean by form? What do you mean by government? And who would you like to start with? We can start with Plato, or we can start with Machiavelli. We can start with the Thrasymachus question in Republic, or we can go to In other words, what are we saying? Well, they've been educated. Educated what? In what way? To consider the historical precedent. So in other words, watch this. When we pick up the opening lines of this essay, called the I Have a Dream speech, it was of course written as an essay to be delivered. One of the first things we're going to see is the term 50 years ago, right away. And immediately we're going to reference that this actually is hearkening back to another speech that was given, that's a very famous speech in American political thought, that begins 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Who was the one who said that? Well, his name was Abraham Lincoln, and that was, of course, the famous Gettysburg Address. Ironically, as freshmen, we study the I Have a Dream speech, and then later in your junior year, we will study the Gettysburg Address. Of course, if the truth were known, we should probably study the Gettysburg Address first, so that when Martin Luther King makes his references to it, alludes to it, A-L-L-U-D-S, alludes to it, you'll have some sense of why. Of course, guess where Martin Luther King is giving the speech that's so famous in American political thought, the I Have a Dream speech? On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And in fact, here in a bit, after we've studied this, we're going to watch this speech, and you're going to see that powerful effect of there is Martin Luther King Jr. standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and behind him is a huge monument of who? Well, none other than Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, that important document that speaks directly to the importance of all men are created equal from our own founding document of the Declaration of Independence. So consideration of the historical precedent, hey, you want to write this down. You always want to consider both sides of your argument. Remember, if you're writing persuasively, you're writing with an arguable thesis, which means there's two sides to the issue. It gets dark at night is not an arguable thesis, right? Because there's no debate there. But when you are talking about a real arguable thesis, that means there's two sides. You always want to make sure you reference both sides. See, I have students and they're right, their view is right. Everybody else's view is wrong. There isn't any reason to think about why other people's views are wrong. I already know they're wrong. If we're doing proper consideration of historical precedent, we're always thinking about the other side. Number two, the challenge, of course, is to keep the reader reading. Or in the case of the two speeches we're going to be listening to, keep the listener listening. See, because watch this. If I'm having a conversation with one of you, and I say something that offends you, you just get up and walk out of 303. I can, of course, chase you down the hall and go, hey, you misunderstood what I was saying. What I was actually saying was this. And you and I can have a dialogue, and you can go, oh, I thought you said X. No, I said Y. You thought I said X, I said Y. And you go, oh, okay. See, we can do that when we're speaking to each other. But when you're reading, the minute you stop reading my argument, the minute you stop reading, it's over for me. Persuasion is done for me as a chance, right? Does that make sense? In other words, the challenge is I have to keep you reading. Of course, if I'm writing. Of course, if I'm speaking, I also have to be able to keep you listening. Now, how do I do that? Well, along with consideration of the historical precedent, write this down. If I present both sides of the argument, you will consider me fair-minded. You'll consider me less of what we call a demagogue, where I'm just giving my opinion and I don't care about your opinion. Okay? But secondly, when I do this thing called conceding a point, let's write that one down. That's the second thing. If the first one is consideration of the historical precedent, the second is what we call conceding a point. Now, what does that mean? Simple. I say something that the acrimonious audience, write the term down and we'll define it, that the acrimonious audience will agree with. Acrimony just means nasty. The acrimonious audience is the audience I'm speaking to that won't agree with me. Do you got me? Of course, when I'm writing or reading or speaking in persuasive, there will be some people who probably will agree with me. Yes? But there will be other people who will outright not agree with me. That's what we call the acrimonious audience. So when I concede a point, what I do is I will say something that audience will agree with. Okay? But then I immediately will follow it up with a special word. The word is but, or however. Years ago, I used to give my seniors an assignment. Really torque them off. The assignment was the topic, war is good. The audience that they have to write to is a bunch of peace activists out in Nevada who are chained to a chain link fence outside of a testing facility. That's the audience. Well, you can imagine that the thesis, war is good, is of course going to be a hostile kind of idea to a group of peace activists. And I said, you have to write the essay. Ready, go. And they would get very, very frustrated. How exactly are you going to do that? I said, watch this. Instead of starting out saying war is good, which is of course a kind of crazy proposition in and of itself, begin by saying this: war is terrible. It ruins all kinds of economies. It destroys family. It alienates people, and of course lots of people end up dead. However, sometimes war is necessary. Notice the subtle rhetorical technique that's being used. Now I'm pointing this out because you're going to see this in both of the speeches that we're going to look at. Where something is said, the acrimonious audience is going to say, I totally agree with that. But then right after, it will be followed up with the conjunction but, or, however, to show, in other words, you know what's going on. Now, of course, you already know this as freshmen, because when you go up to your ma, you need something, and you say, Ma, you look really nice today. Your ma probably says something like, no, it's not happening. What? I didn't even get a chance to ask. No, you're buttering me up for something. I know it's not happening. That's called conceding a point. In other words, they know already rhetorically that you're saying something about their looks, your ma's looks, only because you're actually wanting something afterwards. We play the same game rhetorically, and you'll even see it in the two speeches that we're playing with here. In other words, can we say this out loud? Both Martin Luther King Jr. as well as FDR know that the stuff they're talking about, there will be people who disagree entirely with what they're saying. Totally disagree. And they're aware of that. In other words, they're considering their audience. All right? We now turn to the speech itself and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Let's start, of course, with dates. 1929 to 1968. Of course, the 1968 is the tragedy, right? Because King was assassinated. He was killed. Before we get there, though, notice our big question that we've been asking, of course, in Unit 3 for all of these pieces of nonfiction, right? Our big question, is knowledge the same thing as understanding or wisdom? Of course, we got our vocabulary words at the bottom of 540 that we'll want to pay attention to, certainly as we get ready for this study. The dates again, 1929 to 1968. Let's go ahead now and look at some of the background information of our author. Take a few notes. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most charismatic leaders of the civil rights movement. Charismatic simply means that when he talks, people listen. If this is your first exposure to the I Have a Dream speech, then one of the things students often will say is, there's something really fascinating about when he talks. You're going to actually hear his speech, and then later you're going to watch him give the speech. For study reasons, we'll have two different approaches to this text. And charismatic simply means that he has charisma. It's from a Greek word which means powerful energy. And you'll feel this in his speech. When he is giving the speech, there's tremendous energy in his voice, charismatic. During the 1950s and 1960s, King organized non-violent protests to bring about equal rights for all Americans. King made an observation in a very famous essay that goes something like this. Oppressed peoples, people who are getting jacked on, respond to oppression in three characteristic ways. The first he called acquiescence. You just stand there and let somebody jack on you, you give in. But King makes the argument in that famous essay that when you let somebody jack on you and you don't fight back, you are actually convincing them that what they're doing is okay. It's acceptable. And so he says acquiescence is not acceptable, it's not the way. The second, he says, is corrosive hatred and violence. In other words, you want to come at me, that's why God made a 12 gauge, and I'll blow you away. But King makes the observation, the only problem with violence as a response to oppression is the famous line, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. In other words, every time you upset me or jack on me, I poke out one of your eyes. Every time I jack on you, you poke out one of my eyes. It won't take long and none of us will have any eyes left. You got me? So he says, after the idea of acquiescence not working and violence not working, he reaches for what he calls a Hegelian synthesis, the joining of two opposites, from the great German philosopher Hegel. And he says there's a third way, and that's the way of non-violent resistance. Right? He says we take a little bit from both sides. From the guys who say we should just not fight back, the acquiescence group, he agrees and says we should not use violence. From the group that says we gotta fight back, he says, you're right, but we're not gonna fight with violence. We're going to fight rather with the notion of passionate love. Love for one's brother and sister. And so nonviolent resistance, put this in your notes. Nonviolence, you just read it. Nonviolence is the idea that you fight without violence. For example, you go into Memphis, Tennessee, and all of the trash collectors don't pick up the trash. And he just sits there for days and then weeks, smelling, reeking, causing problems, until finally the white establishment of Memphis is ready to talk with the black trash collectors and say, what is it that you want? Or for example, you're told you cannot go into a restaurant and sit because it's a whites-only restaurant. This happened all the time during the segregated South. So what do? Well, you don't walk in there with a 12 gauge and start blowing people away. No. Instead, you walk in and you sit down at the counter and you wait for somebody to come and tell you cannot sit there because you're African American. Or you're a white person sitting with an African American. And then you just wait to be arrested. And of course the media is going to make sure that this is reported in the news. For the people today who hate the media, the reality is that the civil rights movement, of course, followed many of the sit-ins, as they were called, and other kinds of nonviolent protests. And of course lots and lots of people got arrested, got, of course, terribly treated. But in the end, it raised media attention and began the process for Martin Luther King Jr. of that famous walk, of course, in Montgomery, Alabama, and at Selma. And you have these really famous moments that are iconographic. All of that is being subsumed there in that term, nonviolent resistance. Okay? King, back to the notes on 541. King first came to national attention in 1956 in Montgomery, Alabama, when he organized a 382-day boycott by African Americans of the city's segregated buses. In other words, they wouldn't ride the buses, which started out sounding like a big deal, but ultimately ended up being a serious financial deal, all right? He went on to lead other protests and to speak out eloquently against poverty and social injustice, and of course, assassinated on April the 4th, 1968, his birthday, January 15th, has since become a national holiday. And then, of course, the Did You Know at 35, King became the youngest man and only the third black man to be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the background for this speech we're about to study, the Civil Rights Movement, the U.S. Constitution, read it with me on 541, guarantees certain rights to all Americans. The struggle of African Americans to have their rights recognized is known as the Civil Rights Movement. Marked by demonstrations and legal challenges, this movement began in the 1950s and was led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. All right, let's turn now to the speech itself. We've got some background information that we want to read on 543 really quickly, because speeches are written, read it with me, because speeches are written to be spoken aloud. They are a more fluid form of literature than most other nonfiction. A strong speaker will react to unspoken signals from his or her listeners and adjust the speech accordingly. He or she might choose words or add whole phrases. This is the case with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the greatest speakers of the modern age. The text that appears here represents the speech exactly as it was delivered by Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, we'll get into more conversations about this when you're juniors, but watch this, watch this. The speech that Martin Luther King Jr. actually wrote is not the speech that he gave. As a matter of fact, the most famous part of this speech, I Have a Dream, which is what it's named for, actually predominantly was what we are going to call ad-libbed. It was added on to. The speech that he had written was going in one direction, and then something happened. Now, when you watch the speech, I will ask you, can you tell the moment when King looks up from his script and never looks down again? In other words, at the beginning of the speech, he's reading from his script. And at one point in the speech, which of course becomes the pivotal moment in the speech, he leaves much of the script of the speech, and he goes extemporaneous. And of course, America has never been the same. Now, I want to say this, and I already said this before in a couple of earlier conversations with you. There is an argument that goes something like this, I'm sure you've heard it. You and your generation lack patriotism. You are not patriots, you don't love America, you don't believe in your country, and you really could care less about politics. If any of that is true, and I'm not sure that it is, but if any of that is true, the reason that it's true is because people like me and my generation haven't given you a good reason to be a patriot. See, you're not born a patriot, guys. You choose whether the country that you live in is worthy of your respect. That's called patriotism. How do you get there? Well, I think one of the ways you get there is by studying some of the great moments in your nation's history. So right now, what we want to do now is sit up and we want to pay attention to this speech. Now, I'm going to assume this is not your first time to see this or hear this speech. My guess is you were introduced to it in middle school or maybe even elementary school, maybe on a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday or something like that. Here's the challenge for us now, though. Write this down. At 2B, we will focus on this speech as a work of persuasion. So we're going to ask right away. Jot this down. These are our questions. We'll come back to it at the end of our study here. 1. What is the examples of the consideration of the historical precedent? Looking backwards in time. What does King say about the past that's significant to his study about what's going on right now as he's about to deliver this speech? Okay? Number 2. We have already said out loud the importance of conceding a point. Who do you imagine is the acrimonious audience for this speech? And how does King concede a point, saying something that that acrimonious audience might agree with? And as that happens, you'll want to write that one down. All right? Okay, here we go. We're on 543 now. And our job is just to simply follow along. I really do challenge you. It is a natural tendency to want to just listen to this because it is a speech. And we will watch this speech where we won't read it. We'll just simply watch it. But I challenge you to follow word for word, pointing your finger or the tip of your pen or pencil at the very words. Let's see if you can conquer monkey mind and actually pay attention to this speech all the way through. One of the most famous speeches in American political thought, Martin Luther King Jr.'s